Hello and welcome to Dialogue. After nearly 5 months of hyping the so-called Chinese spy balloon incident, the Pentagon has stated that the airship did not collect any information. What more do we know about the incident? How has the incident affected China-U.S. relations, which have been deteriorating for some time? And what efforts have been made recently to restart high-level communication between the two sides? To help us answer these questions and more, I'm joined today by Harvey Dzodin, Senior Fellow of the Center for China and Globalization, Professor Peter Kuznick of American University, and Professor Huang Jing, Director of the Institute of U.S. and the Pacific Studies of Shanghai International Studies University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Well, Harvey, I will start with you. The Pentagon said the Chinese balloon that floated over the U.S. earlier this year, in February actually, did not collect information about the U.S. military sites or military information. What's your initial response to the news?
Well, it's certainly a change of tune. General Ryder said last Thursday that the U.S. was aware that the balloon had intelligence gathering capabilities, but he said that it didn't collect any sensitive intelligence. He didn't address or apologize for all the frenzy worked up by the U.S. and its allies the past half year. That would have been the decent thing to do. General Ryder did say that the U.S. somehow neutralized the craft's ability to gather intelligence, although we don't know how. It could possibly have been laser bursts or radio signals that blinded or jammed the equipment. He didn't confirm reports by the Wall Street Journal and others that off-the-shelf U.S. equipment was used along with Chinese components. So if I could interject a healthy bit of sarcasm at the beginning of today's dialogue, I'd say that for years the U.S. has jawboned the Chinese to buy American to address the huge U.S. trade deficit with China. But now that there's a possibility that China actually did buy American, it's still being attacked. The default U.S. position is, as always, heads I win, tails you lose. And no, Xinhua, I don't think this is going to bring an end to the U.S. milking the story for all it's worth. I think it still will continue in one form or another.
Mm-hmm. However, as we know, it happened in February. It took 4 months until the end of June or early July. We have this final conclusion. Basically, the balloon was not collecting intelligence of the U.S. So why did it take so long time to reach such a conclusion?
Well, one thing is that the investigations can take a long time, but I just don't buy that. Because we saw how quickly the wreckage of the ill-fated Titan tourist vessel going to the Titanic was located by much less resources than those possessed by the U.S. 2 weeks ago. So to me, a more possible and reasonable explanation is that the U.S. had wanted to tamp down the hyper-hysteria that was driven by itself and its allies, so they buried the story and discussion as long as possible. I do think they knew that the ballooning crisis could spin out of control, pardon the pun, and not only make a military confrontation more likely, but that urgent high-level talks between the two sides could be postponed for a long, long time. Personally, I think Blinken was wrong to cancel his original meeting in February. What happened was all the more reason to have discussed the incident, frankly, in person, behind closed doors at the time. But the U.S. chose to exploit the situation and to milk it for all it was worth. But Blinken's recent visit last month and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's visit later this week gives me a small degree of hope that we can again address urgent issues that both sides face. Mm-hmm. Sadly, though, as you point out, we've lost half a year in the process.
Yes, and now we have Professor Peter Kuznick. Peter, at that time when the incident was reported, the Chinese side explained the balloon was a civilian airship, designed for meteorological research, but somehow went astray. But that explanation was not received in the U.S., which quickly labeled it as a spy balloon and shot it down. Now it's proved its innocence. So I wonder, what do you make of the saga?
I make of it that there is a strong faction in the United States that wants to depict China as the enemy, as a threat to the United States, that talks about Chinese spying. We've got Chinese spy bases now in Cuba. We've got Huawei. We've got TikTok. We've got refrigerators. We've got tram cars. Seems like the Chinese are everywhere spying on the United States. The thing about this incident is that the intelligence community knew all along that this balloon was not transmitting information back to China. And they could have dampened this from the beginning. The media reaction was 24 hours a day. It was nonstop about China spying on the United States, a threat to American security. The announcement recently that China was not spying, that this was not a spy balloon, that it was not collecting and transmitting evidence, got almost no attention. So there is an atmosphere in the United States right now, a dangerous atmosphere of mistrust toward China. And everything China's done and does is seen through this lens now, which creates very, very bad tensions between the U.S. and China that are unnecessary, but feed the interest of a certain faction of American leaders who want to worsen relations, who think that war is inevitable eventually, and want the United States to gird up its positions, to strengthen its positions over the South China Sea, over Taiwan, in order to prepare for that eventuality.
So you are saying that, Peter, the incident was actually hyped and used for a certain purpose, like a confrontation probably between the two countries?
I think if the United States had wanted to, it could have killed this story very, very quickly. But it didn't. And it let it go on for months. And now that Biden has said over time that there was a balloon blown off course, that it was a mistake, it was an embarrassment, that Xi Jinping didn't even know about it. So they've said things to try to correct it, because the tensions between the U.S. and China back in February were much too high. And both sides realized that this was becoming very, very dangerous. So they've tried to walk it back since then. But we have to remember there is something like 63,000 balloons launched every year, sometimes 900 a day. And it wasn't just one balloon. Then they shot down with these Sidewinder missiles 3 more balloons. And these balloons, one of them, they said, was a $12 hobby balloon that they used a $400,000 missile to shoot down. What kind of sense does any of this make?
Well, Harvey, the Pentagon did say the balloon had intelligence collection capabilities. It's a bit vague here because, in terms of capabilities, if you have a mobile phone, for example, if you have a camera, you have the recording capability, well, you can use your mobile phone to collect information or collect intelligence. Yes, I mean, if there's a camera on the balloon, it can take pictures. What does this remark say, actually?
It shows that the U.S. doesn't have its act together. And by mentioning this fact now, they're, I think, digging themselves in even deeper. As the professor just said, the U.S. could have disclosed what it knew and when it knew it a long time ago, as far back as the beginning of February, but they chose not to do that. So I think that they wanted to play this incident, well, like a violin kind of, and to use it to further demonize China, as the U.S. always seems to do. But I think that the U.S. now realizes that it pushed this narrative so far that it severely harmed bilateral relations, and that the direction in which the situation was going was very, very bad. And they decided to put a stop to it. But that said, as the professor said a moment ago, there was so much hype about this story back in late January and in early February that General Ryder, I have to say, General Ryder's comments last week are too little, they're too late, and they're not going to notice because people take it as a fact in the U.S. and in much of the world outside of China that this was, in fact, a spy balloon and not anything else. And I think that has lasting and negative consequences as we go forward in the near and the middle future.
Well, Peter, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said after his recent trip to Beijing that the balloon chapter should be closed. Given this statement from Pentagon for confirming the balloon was not connecting intelligence, so is there a consideration of the timing in terms of this statement now, or is this an effort to finally close this chapter here?
China reacted very strongly to the U.S. shooting down that balloon. China thought this was a crazy overreaction and understood that there were some in the U.S. who were using this as a pretext for worsening relations. Then Blinken canceled his trip. And the discussions, they still have not, even Blinken's visit was not very successful. They did not reestablish military-to-military communications, which are necessary and do make the world safer. And so they had some agreement on drugs and on cultural exchanges, but they are moving forward slowly. And Janet Yellen will be visiting this week, and they are trying to reestablish some ties. There are people within both governments who are hardliners, who don't trust each other, who think that the other government is using every advantage it has to assert hegemony. And the U.S. thinks of itself as the hegemon. Even in these recent discussions, the Chinese like to talk about win-win diplomacy. If you heard Antony Blinken's interview with Richard Haass from the Council on Foreign Relations, Blinken said the U.S. and its views will prevail in Asia. The U.S. insists upon maintaining its hegemony, which it has had in the Pacific since World War II, at least. But what we've seen since 2011 is the quote-unquote Asia pivot and the militarization of the Pacific and effectively surrounding China with bases, with weapons, and trying to control the narrative as well as the facts on the ground in the Pacific. But China is a rising power. China is the #2 economy in the world. China has a huge navy now. China is a stronger country. And so it looks to many that we're headed for a collision. And that's what worries us so much. When you have General Minihan saying he thinks that war between the United States and China is likely by 2025, people try to walk that kind of comment back, but he's not alone. And there are many American think tanks. We've got the Center for New American Security. We've got the Council on Foreign Relations. We've got others that are quite hawkish, that are pushing for a confrontation and think that the U.S. window of opportunity is closing. And the sooner we get this on, the better, because it's inevitable. I think they're crazy. I think it could lead to World War III. It could lead to the use of nuclear weapons, which could spin out of control. I mean, we could lose cities. We could lose millions, billions of people over this. And we need cooler heads to prevail in both the United States and China. And the Chinese have tried. But there are still people in the United States who are looking for that confrontation and think it's to America's advantage.
Now we have Professor Huang Jing on the line. Huang Jing, we talked about this impact of the balloon incident from February, and now it proved its innocence. It was not collecting the intelligence or information of the U.S. military deployment, and it's probably just a weather balloon. But still, of course, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken so planned trip to China was canceled. So that's probably one of the victims of the incident. What else do you see this saga, this episode has probably harmed this bilateral relationship?
First, it is United States that said this is a spy balloon and shot it down after almost over weeks of all those blah blah, and then United States retrieved the shot down balloon. So it's America's responsibility to give the entire world, especially China, explanation because they got the so-called evidence. Of course, now they said the balloon did not collect any information, intelligence information. I agree with the previous speaker said. This is mostly a reflection of internal politics of the United States, number one. Number two, I think Biden administration was so weak to really manage or control the situation, let it blow out of proportion. So that's for, it's to really to please the internal audience, for the internal gains that it has created this entire story, which now it has to came out to say it's not true. I think it's indeed an embarrassment for United States, the number one power on earth, to make up such story out of this. Should be an ordinary event, because we have thousands of balloons like this being released all over the world, and in China, United States, we see this kind of things all over, and this is really, from today's point of looking back, it's a little bit ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Well, Huang Jing, of course, if you look at this, the allegations, including the allegations of this so-called spy balloon back in February, and there are other allegations on the, against the Chinese side. For example, China knew the Russian military plan against Ukraine last year in February because Putin was in Beijing, or China was alleged to have provided lethal weapons to Russia. Allegations or accusations like these sometimes are simply rumors, but why they are there and alive?
I think if you look at all those stories or allegations that only have one pattern, that is the United States government or senior officials came out very strong. The allegation seems quite solid, and then they fail to produce any evidence. Then they become silent. Eventually, if they have to say this is not true. And this is again, I think, for the internal politics of consumption, internal politics. It is that on the one hand, on the other hand, it has to try to grasp, occupy moral high ground, put China on the defense, so that it can gain something. I think this entire thing is right now. It's a kind of game that almost like a broken record. It only tells three things. Number one, there is such a force so strong in the United States want to take China as enemy. Whatever problem they come across, it's China's fault on China. Number one. And number two, there are some internal factions or forces that do not stand on the same page. So that in order to overcome this kind of challenge, internal challenge, they have to blame China so that they're on the same page again. Last but not the least, number three, that the Biden administration is really so weak to manage internal situations, so that it has to let it leash out for some internal gains. All of this, of course, has really, I think, has really undermined not only the prestige and reputation of the United States, but essentially undermined the entire stability and peace across the Pacific.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Huang Jing, there. And Harvey, as part of the response to the accusation of the incident, back in February, the U.S. Commerce Department, I believe, blacklisted 6 Chinese companies in relation to the incident, saying they are part of the so-called balloon surveillance program. Now, the U.S. has declared the balloon did not collect any information. Do you think it's the time for the U.S. probably to set free, saying that these Chinese companies, they are innocent?
Yes, but I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell, as the saying goes, if past practices are any predictor. So bilateral relations are still suffering from once and possible future President Donald Trump's massive multi-billion-dollar tariffs that he imposed in 2018 under Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act. And they're still in effect, and they continue to hurt U.S. businesses and consumers, and they should have been taken away long ago. And relations are suffering from U.S. and allied efforts to contain China's rise by blocking its progress in many areas, especially high technologies. Chinese companies like Huawei and TikTok continue to be aggressively targeted by U.S. sanctions over absolutely unproven assertions that they spy on Americans and others. But it's in fact the U.S. who's engaging in spy activities, but who take a stance that rules are made for thee, not for me. In 2021, the latest year for which data has been released, under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the U.S. surveilled about 250,000 non-U.S. persons, and that number doesn't even include U.S. citizens who were interacting with those people. The only hope I can see might be that the U.S. recognizes that with its economy challenged by high inflation, that it can ease its own economic burden by rescinding the punitive U.S. actions. But frankly, Chindwa, I don't think that's very likely.
Speak of that, Peter, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is coming to Beijing very soon this week. Do you expect, any touch upon this lifting the sanctions or partially lifting the sanctions on or tariffs, I would say, on the Chinese goods, exported to the U.S. During their talk with the Chinese counterparts?
I hope so, but I expect some small progress. There's at least got to be something cosmetic coming out of this long visit. She will not be meeting with Xi Jinping, but she will be meeting with other Chinese officials. We have to remember that the United States sanctions approximately 1,000 Chinese companies. Now, a lot of this, as the professor said, has to do with internal U.S. politics. If Biden shows any weakness at all, the Republicans jump down his throat. It was the Republicans who were demanding that they release this report about the spy balloon. Marco Rubio, who knows next to nothing about international affairs, was among the loudest. Then there was just this week a U.S. delegation to Taiwan, headed by Mike Rogers, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. And the delegation included 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. So Biden is in a difficult position because he's not only got the Republicans jumping down his throat, he's got his own hawkish Democrats. That's part of what's troubling about the U.S. now. It used to be the Republicans who were hawks. The Democrats are just as hawkish as the Republicans are now. And there are very few voices for reason, sanity, stepping back, looking for off-ramps, win-win diplomacy, friendly relations. If you talk that kind of position, you get accused of being an appeaser, of being weak, anti-American. It's a very dangerous atmosphere that reminds many of us of what it was like during the old Cold War. And that's a very unhealthy atmosphere in the U.S., where even Fareed Zakaria said this kind of groupthink in the United States is very dangerous. And you're hearing this across the board now. So yes, I hope that Yellen can produce some very good agreements and kind of roll some of this back, but I'm not terribly optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Harvey, Peter mentioned about the U.S. domestic politics, and then, people are concerned with this upcoming 2024 presidential election. In the time running up to the election in particular, candidates will be competing for being tougher on China. So how will that affect, or will that, make the relationship even worse?
Absolutely. I'm not very optimistic as the calendar goes closer and closer to the election. I think there's too many headwinds pushing back any progress and too many tailwinds pushing the two countries into more confrontation. And the election season just makes this all the more difficult because we're down to a game of who can out criticize China. So let's watch Trump and DeSantis, Biden and Robert Kennedy, compete to the bottom. Like an old song goes, how low can they go? In this context, though, I think it's too low for comfort because the U.S. Public opinion is already at rock bottom about China, and it can't go much lower. It's now about 12%, I believe, for people who say that they have a favorable view or somewhat favorable view about China. And this number was in the 50s at the beginning of 2018 before Trump got going. So we're in a very perilous situation, and I don't see it ending well. And because of the nature of our political system, I think it's going to turn what's now very bad into what's going to be much worse. And I worry that we will or can go to war sooner rather than later. And we need to start communicating better so we can address some of the common issues that we share, not put all our energy into demonizing and zero-summing the other side.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, with this worst scenario, probably as a possible prospect between the two countries, people say there's a window opportunity to stabilize the relationship between Beijing and Washington during the time running up to the 2024 elections in the U.S. So we are seeing also high-level visits such as that of Janet Yellen and Antony Blinken. So is that the case? We are now having this window opportunity, and we should make good use of it?
Yeah, we should make good use of it. But I agree with Javi. I'm not terribly optimistic. This looming election, if anything, puts pressure on Biden to show how tough he is, especially because of his age, especially because the Republicans are going to attack him from the right as being soft. Biden wants to show not only that he can get out a sentence without making any errors, but that he can stand up to the Chinese. Xi Jinping is a strong leader. He's seen as a strong leader. Putin used to be seen as a strong leader, maybe not the last couple of weeks, but Biden wants to be seen as a strong leader. That does not mean making compromises. That does not mean understanding the position of your adversary. It means showing how tough you are, and if anything, not making concessions. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Raimondo's visit. I hope the Chinese visits to the United States. I hope that Janet Yellen's visit will yield progress, and that Biden will have the wisdom to put himself forward more as a peace candidate. When Biden got elected, we had hopes that he was going to break with the Trump policy. But then when we saw his advisors, who were all the China hawks, we really quickly realized that that was not going to be the case. And if anything, Biden doubled down on what Trump was doing and added his own. So Biden has a lot of room to walk back. Hopefully, they got scared by how tense things became after this balloon incident. But Biden has 4 times said that dismissed America's idea of strategic ambiguity when it comes to Taiwan. Biden says that the U.S. will get militarily involved if there's fighting over Taiwan. Biden has said the U.S. will come to Japan's aid militarily over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. He says similar things with the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing is the tough macho Biden. We're not seeing the peaceful Biden, who we hope will make concessions and move in the right direction.
Well, thank you, Peter and Harvey. With that, we come to the end for today's show. Again, many thanks to our guests today. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qingduo. See you next time.